Hi guys, this is Ollie from iwillteachyoualanguage.com, and today I'm going to be talking about Japanese. It's a fantastic language, but there's no denying that it's a tough one. I think the British Foreign Office classifies it as one of the 4 or 5 most difficult languages in the world, and obviously that's for native English speakers. If you are already familiar with, say, Chinese, or if you have some grounding in Chinese characters, it's definitely a lot easier. But I thought it would be interesting to look at why Japanese is difficult, and I'm going to look at it from my own perspective. I spent a number of years studying Japanese, and with some success. Success in some areas, not so much success in others. Personally, I'm pretty good at speaking, and I had a lot of Japanese friends and spent a lot of time speaking. But my kanji is not what it should be, and so I still have trouble reading. Nevertheless, I'm pretty familiar with the way that the language works, and I'm going to talk about 5 things which, for me, have proven to be challenging in my learning. Those 5 things are: number 1, kanji, the Chinese characters. Number 2, the nature of Japanese vocabulary. Number 3, the difference between 2 types of Japanese, a formal and casual style. Number 4, the formulaic nature of the language. And then number 5, the grammar of Japanese. So first of all, kanji. Without a doubt, if you spend time with people who are learning Japanese, or if you go to Japan, the bane of everyone's life is kanji. In many ways, the way that you can evaluate, or the way that many people try to evaluate their level in Japanese, is by how many kanji they know, which has got some merits. Certainly the exam system doesn't help. The Japanese exam system, kanji knowledge is graded at every level in the Japanese school system, and that's also transferred onto the Nihongo no Ryoku Shiken, which is or the JLPT, the Japanese language proficiency test for foreigners. So kanji is the kind of the holy grail for a lot of people, and there's no denying that it's when you compare it to the 26 letters of English, it's an awfully big challenge. You've got to learn, there are many thousands of kanji. There are, I think it's 1,981 kanji in daily use, according to the government's official list, but in reality there are more. These are just the ones which the newspapers restrict themselves to. Now, in my experience, because of the fact that I had friends that I would write to and text and email in Japan, I got to around, I'd guess around 500 or 600 kanji that are kind of in daily use on a casual, informal level, the kind of words that you might text to each other about meeting up or saying what you're doing, for example. So for me, those kanji, I learnt them pretty quickly through just exposure to them, and got to use them quite flexibly, I think. But then there was a whole other load of kanji which I would not come across particularly often, and which I never really got round to learning through sheer laziness, to be honest with you. And yeah, you really have to set about learning kanji. There's no question about it, and you have to find your own system. Everyone will tell you a different method. I think ultimately it's down to brute force. When you've got such a large amount of things to learn, you just got to get on with it. There's no way around it. What school kids do is they have lists to learn every week, and they just copy them out hundreds of times in their notebooks, and they eventually learn them. I would think that it's probably, in my experience, I think it's probably necessary for us to do something similar. There might be some shortcuts, but essentially I think you don't really know a kanji until you can actually write it as well as read it. But anyway, there are people who swear by certain systems. There is one book which you hear a lot about called Learning the Kanji. A number of my friends absolutely swear by that book. And the reason kanji is important is because it's really the key to everything. When you start to combine the Chinese characters together, you get different, huge combinations of words. You know, because the kanji is not just limited to that one character itself. When you combine that one character with another, or with another, you know, you get whole different areas of meaning and different words created. And of course, if you don't learn the kanji, then the problem is that you can't read much at all. And if you can't read, then you are effectively denying yourself one of the most important forms of input. You know, if you can't read, then you're restricted to listening, and then you can't listen for hours and hours a day. It's not practical. So you need to be able to read, and in order to read, you need to learn the kanji. So that's the first challenge that anyone studying Japanese is going to face. It's probably the biggest, I'd say, in terms of amount of work. So let's get that one out of the way. Now, the nature of Japanese vocabulary is that there are many alternative words in a lot of cases, and the alternative can be down to a number of reasons. It could be an alternative that's down to register, so if you're speaking more politely or more formally, then you might use a different word. And on the other hand, there might be, in some cases, there are words which have a different nuance, a nuance that we wouldn't necessarily have in English, for example. And of course, when you learn these words, you ultimately have to learn what the nuance is and what the register is, and so it's tough. So even for example, to say "I," the word "I," which we only have one word for this in English. In Japanese, you've got a lot. You have the watashi, watakushi, ore, boku, uchi, jibun. There's a number of different ways of saying these things, and those words are all going to be used by different people in different circumstances, and so that's one example of something very basic that, coming from an English perspective, is really tough. Now, in terms of nuances with words, you have, for example, the difference between kureru, morau, itadaku. Three words with very similar meanings if you were to translate into the English, but of course in Japanese they have very different nuances, and in the case of itadaku, a different register as well. So that's what it means is it's not enough just to learn the word or the translation of the word from English. You have to learn a lot of nuance that comes along with it. So this is the second thing that I had, big trouble with. The third thing is the difference between what we call keigo, and which is a formal Japanese, the kind of Japanese you might use at work or speaking to someone older than you, or even someone that you don't know, and then casual Japanese, which is used between friends and generally by young people. Now, to all intents and purposes, keigo and casual Japanese are two different languages. In so many cases, you've got at least one completely different word to express something, depending on the register. And you have to speak in a different tone altogether. And you can't, under any circumstances, switch to the other one. This is what makes it tough. If you're in a business situation or at work, or speaking to someone older than you, and you suddenly switch into casual kind of Japanese, you're going to really offend someone. And then likewise, if you're with your mates and you suddenly start talking keigo, you're going to get laughed out of the room. So you've got to learn these two different languages, dialects. I'm not really sure what the best way to describe them is, and you have to be able to employ them in exactly the right situation. And only very occasionally can you mix them. And if you do, you have to do so with complete certainty. So that's the third issue for foreigners learning Japanese. The fourth thing is tricky because different people will give you different takes on this. I think it's an extremely important part of the language, and it's the fact that Japanese is very formulaic. Now, we're not really talking about the language so much here, but we're talking about the culture. There are quite extensive social situations in which you're expected, I don't know if required is the right word, but you're certainly expected to follow certain steps in the conversation. And examples might be ordering food in a restaurant if you're with a big group of people, introducing yourself, apologising. All of these things follow they follow very rigidly set exchanges between people, and this is what is expected. It's a very impersonal thing in a way, but it is nevertheless what is done in Japan. And the problem comes when you deviate from this. In English we tend to encourage people to be pretty honest and to say what we think in any particular situation. But in Japanese, that's not the case. And so for the foreigner coming to speak Japanese, the temptation is to be very honest and very upfront and say whatever's on your mind. But what that does is that has the effect of unsettling the person that you're talking to. Because they're expecting you to say something, they're expecting you to say one thing, and then you come out with something else, and it throws them. You've broken the pattern, you've broken the formula, and that puts a kind of very awkward tension in between you and the person that you're talking to. So it's very real, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on who you speak to or their social role or their social status. But it's very real, and you need to get good at these. So that's number 4. Number 5 is grammar. Now, Japanese grammar, in one sense, is not particularly difficult in that there are a number of rules. In fact, there are extensive rules and extensive grammatical considerations in the language. However, the rules on the whole stack up. There are not that many exceptions, and you can, to a certain extent, learn the rules for something and follow them, and you'll be all right. You can't say the same of English. If you imagine the situations are reversed and you've got a Japanese person, or any other person for that matter, learning English, they often get taught rules about certain grammatical features, such as the present perfect is a classic example. But what you find is, the more rules you learn, the more you realise that there are more exceptions to the rule than there are instances of the rule actually working. And so, it's extremely difficult for people in English to understand how to say things properly, because the rules are essentially redundant in a lot of cases. But not so in Japanese. If you are capable of learning all of the rules, then they work most of the time. The difficulty comes in the nuances of these of the various grammatical features in Japanese, because a lot of grammar in Japanese carries an awful lot of nuance, and there can be nuances of various different sorts. It can be something that's positive or negative. It can be something which is to do with sequencing events in time, or something to do with causality, expressing the reason for something or the fault for something. And a lot of Japanese grammatical elements carry a lot of these nuances within them. Now, because a lot of these things have no particular equivalent in English, it's an awful lot of new information to learn, and this presents a real problem for someone that's coming at this fresh. But you do have to learn this because what happens is, because this grammar carries this nuance, then a lot of other stuff goes unsaid. For example, if I use some grammar which has a certain nuance, and I know that you or I expect that you understand this nuance, I don't then need to go and say a lot of other things, because this nuance has already, you've already been communicated a certain piece of information within this grammatical construct, which can be very confusing. I mean, I get this quite a lot when I'm reading. I find that I read something and I get to the end of it, and I think, well, what's this all about? What's just happened? I don't understand the message of what I've just read. And the reason is often because there is a particular verb ending, or a particular grammatical morpheme or grammatical structure, which is there, which conveys some information which I just didn't get. So that's the fifth thing that I found extremely challenging when I'm learning Japanese. So as you can tell, a lot of these things boil down to one thing, which is the fact that whatever it is, whether it's the kanji or whether it's formulaic expressions or whether it's grammatical information, in each case there is no equivalent in English, which means we have to learn Japanese creating a new kind of meaning for ourselves for the first time. And this takes time, which means that ultimately you need an awful lot of exposure to the language. Thinking in your own language, in English for example, and translating into Japanese or vice versa is not going to get you very far with Japanese. Whereas with Spanish, for example, which has a fairly close grammar to English, you might be able to do that, think in English and speak in Spanish, and it kind of works a lot of the time. Not the case in Japanese. So the message from all of this, I think, is get yourself as much exposure as possible, spoken, written, learn the kanji, start reading. It's going to take a long time and it's a long journey, but it's extremely gratifying, and it's very much worth it, because Japanese is a fascinating language, and Japan itself has an incredibly unique and rich culture that you get access to when you've learnt the language. So I would really encourage you to keep going, or to get started if you haven't already, and to keep going, because it's well worth it. So thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to check out the blog at iwillteachyoualanguage.com, and see you next time.